Good evening, everyone. We'll be starting in about 15 minutes. So thank you for joining us. If you'd like to invite a friend, feel free to do so at this time. But again, we're looking forward to having you with us and to Adam presenting tonight on healthy soil, healthy food. Thank you again. We thank everyone for their patience and welcome you to the webinar. We should be starting in another 9 minutes. So again, welcome, and we so look forward to our webinar tonight. And thank you for joining us on our new webinar portal. So again, we'll be starting in about 9 minutes. Once again, welcome to all of our viewers that are starting to log in to tonight's webinar. We appreciate you joining us tonight. If while we're waiting, we have 4 minutes left. If you can find the chat feature at the bottom of your screen, I'd like to know where you're coming from and if you are viewing this with anyone else or in a group. If you're having issues with the chat, Feel free to text me directly at 413-214-1237. We'd love to know where you all are coming from and where you're joining us from for tonight's webinar. We'll be starting in about 4 minutes. Thank you so much. All right, everyone, good evening, and thank you again for joining us. Welcome to our monthly series, Inspiring Ideas from Experts in the Field. The webinar is in our third year for NOFA Mass, and it is our hope that we can make quality farm management education, organic gardening, easily accessible to everyone, anytime, anywhere. My name is Anna Gilbert Muhammad, and I'm the Food Access and Webinar Coordinator for NOFA Mass. My email is anna@nofamass.org. Feel free to contact me with feedback about this webinar with any food access and food justice questions. Before we start tonight's broadcast, I would like to thank our sponsors, Frontier Natural Products, Simply Organic, UMass Risk Management Crop Insurance Education Program, for supporting the production of this series. Also, many thanks to all of the NOFA Mass staff and board who have helped to make this workshop possible, and for the use of our brand new webinar portal that we are experiencing tonight. And I'd like to add a little disclaimer. This is the first time we are going live with our webinar portal, so we may have a few technical difficulties. Please bear with us as we work through this first live run of our webinar. Lastly, if you are not a member of NOFA Mass, we'd love for you to consider joining so that you can support our education and policy work. For more information, you can visit our website at www.nofamass.org. Tonight's presenter will be Adam Jankowskis of City Compost. And our format for tonight's webinar will be a little different. Instead of the usual presentation and question and answers at the end, you'll be able to submit questions as Adam is presenting. And so what we ask is that you can either use the chat feature, and knowing that this is the first time that we're using it live, I believe it's at the bottom of your screen. It's at the bottom of my screen. If you cannot find it, do not worry. You can text them to me directly at 413-214-1237. Again, that is 413-214-1237. And that way we can answer your questions for you and get those to Adam. So at this time, I'm not going to delay any further. I want to turn everything over to Adam so that he can get into the meat of his presentation tonight. He'll be talking about healthy soil, healthy food, and how it relates to compost. And so at this time, I'd like to find out, Adam, you're on the line, correct?
I am, yes.
Okay. So Adam, you can go ahead and get started. And make sure you share your screen.
Yes, I will share that right now. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this evening. I'm looking forward to sharing some information with you guys on compost, composting, and going into quality, also trace minerals. When it comes to composting is something I wanted to touch upon. I'll talk about organic matter as well. So organic when it comes to compost from a organic farming perspective, or organic growing, gardening, and then also organic matter when it comes to like the material itself and how how compost has organic material in it from a physical soil perspective, and also touch upon the biology as well. I do find that most people like me to do a quick overview on the composting process for an educational perspective. And I imagine many of you are, seasoned composters. So I am going to go through this relatively quickly with the presentation overall, just because it is a little bit larger and I do have a limited amount of time to present to everybody today. And if there's any questions that you have at the end, I can stay for a little bit depending on how long the webinar will allow for us to be live, and then feel free to follow up with me as well. So to start things off, just to give a kind of a quick background on myself. So I started City Compost, officially left it as a full-time thing in July 2013. Present day, we're providing service to about 2,000 homes and businesses. We have a team of about 13 people out there, throughout the week, and we're currently looking for land to expand capacity to, process more and more of the compostables that we're picking up. This is kind of just a snapshot of where we're currently providing service. This was as of about a month ago now. So, we have, added some more on in some different areas, but if we're not in someone's town at this point in time, we always just let them know, like, we'll try to get there. So if there's something you ever, thought would be of interest, and if, say you lived in Pittsfield, I would still try to get somebody out there. I know we go as far north as Amesbury. And, sometimes it's just a matter of getting more people in the area to sign up so that way we can get denser and everything. So again, today's topic, we'll do a quick overview of composting. And we'll go into some trace minerals, your elemental values beyond NPK. We're going to look at a couple soil tests as well and do some comparisons of those when it comes to like the properties of compost. And then we'll talk about organic matter and National Organic Program in terms of organics and kind of the care-abouts with compost there. There's a couple other, organizations I've come across too that I'm going to mention real quick as, potential resources for everybody when it comes to, the correlation between soil quality and food and growing more and adding, getting more diverse crops and stuff. But so finished compost, just to kind of, get into the quick overview of the material itself. The time to make compost is going to depend upon the time that you put in. The more you're interacting with the material, the more you're turning it, the more you're, aerating the pile, the faster it is going to turn into soil. There's going to be a lot of bacteria in there. If it's hot, it's still curing. It needs to cool down a little bit. Even right when it's done, a few weeks is still good to let all that bacteria die off. It's holding on to a lot of the nitrogen that's available in the soil that you want to release so that it doesn't be bound up for access for plants. Finished compost isn't going to be generating any heat. If you were able to reach higher temperatures, then weed seeds would die off. You have pathogen reduction as well. And then most of the material is going to be not recognizable. You should be able to, if you have a good compost, you should be able to grab it in your hand, squeeze it together, it should clump. But, once you kind of touch that clump, it should break apart relatively easy. It shouldn't, stick like a ball of clay. There's different methods I put composting in quotes here because I feel the only true method of composting is aerobic composting. That's with bacteria decomposition in the presence of oxygen. Aerobic means with air, with oxygen. Anaerobic means without. When you have anaerobic digestion, it's something that you guys may have heard recently. The state does have a handful of digesters that are being put in place. I feel that that's for methane gas extraction. If you have anaerobic decomposition when it's not in a controlled vessel system, then you'll get that nasty smell. That's why your compost pile might start to smell on you if it's too wet, if it's not aerated properly. Then you're going to have methane gas. Vermicomposting is worm composting. Limited temperature ranges there, so you're not going to look to get a hot pile because the worms would die off. And they also don't eat, everything that the other two processes can handle. Keeping a pile healthy, so 3-to-1 browns to greens ratio, that translates to carbon and nitrogen. That's going to maintain a sustainable environment for the microbes. You're going to have moisture in there as well, so that way everything can kind of move around. But it shouldn't be sopping wet. That would take up the space that would be necessary for air, and that your pile is going to go anaerobic. The heat, the pile size is really what allows for you to generate heat. Minimum pile size, you're going to be looking for like a cubic yard or more. That pile will self-insulate, and that's what will allow you to get to your higher temperatures. You want a range of particle sizes as well, not just a bunch of really small pieces. You could have a perfect ratio with coffee grounds and sawdust, but because everything's really, really small, it's going to be packed together. So, you can have a variety of size particles. It helps allow for everything to access the full medium. There's a lot of products out there too, like enzymes, starters, inoculants. They're not necessary. If you wanted to accelerate your process a little bit, you could sprinkle a little bit of soil on to start things off. But no accelerant is really required. Balancing the material. So potential problems at home, you're going to look to avoid for, your inputs are meat, dairy, breads, grains, that sort of thing. That's not that those will not compost. They actually compost just fine. It's just a matter of the potential risks of attracting additional insects, animals, odor generation as well. And then other things to, avoid, of course, chemicals, pesticides, certain things have been treated, diseased plants because the temperatures aren't going to heat up oftentimes to cause those pathogens to die off. And then, animal feces from, dogs, birds, cats. There's harmful viruses in there that are harmful to us, and then that could remain in your system. But like, hamster bedding, rabbits, that sort of stuff, those are fine. So browns to greens, this is kind of your carbon. So your carbon to nitrogen ratio is your science behind browns to greens. So if you look in the left there, you'll see your group 1 organics from the U.S. Composting Council. So that's all your dry brown material. Typically, your brown material is going to be dry. Of course, that's not always true. If you have a pile of leaves and just rain and you put that in your compost, it's not going to help dry things off. Whereas your food material is typically wet. Everything from the kitchen is going to be between around 15:1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. You might read it differently in different places. I've seen 17:1 too. It depends on what the material is. Different foods are going to have different elemental compositions. Aeration is by far the most vital aspect of a pile. I mean, your greens to browns ratio could be a little off. If it's too brown, it's just going to take longer. If it's too green, it'll still process. You're just going to have higher risks of it going sour. But if you make sure your pile stays aerated, you should never have an issue with odor. And so, a big portion of that is the moisture. They kind of go hand in hand, because the more water that's in a system, the less room for air that is present. And so continual aerating is vital when it comes to compost. So temperature, the hotter the pile, the faster it processes. When we're looking at food quality, organic standard, 131 degrees, depending upon the process technology that's being implemented, whether it's like a bin or a windrow. The length of it being at that temperature can vary. You'll have pathogens die off, like E. coli, salmonella, like between 140 and 150 degrees. Weed seeds will also die off as well. The cyclophilic, mesophilic, thermophilic, those are just different types of bacteria that are present within the soil, and they're categorized based upon the temperatures that they live within. And that's what those terms are there. The chart on the right, so you can see even when it's outside, it was freezing, 32 degrees when this pile was built. You can see the temperature got up to, well over 150 degrees, just in a few days. That dip there, right around day 7, if you guys can see my mouse, that's when I turned the pile. So I measured it before, I turned it, measured it immediately afterwards, and then 8 hours later. And so the pile, you can see how it climbed right back up. And if this table were to extend, you would see a kind of a waveform that would, be like this. Every pile turning, it's going to get a little bit cooler, then would start to heat back up until the compost process gets near complete. Of course, every peak of every wave would be slightly lower than the historic peak, because the material is starting to move farther along in the process. So, potential issues. So if it smells, methane, it's lack of oxygen. If it smells like rotten eggs, it's too moist. Ammonia, too much nitrogen. If it's really, really slow, it could be due to a lack of moisture, or it could be due to particle size. And then, the heat is the pathogen survival. So not necessarily an issue you might see, but it's nice to have a faster process too. If you're going to compost and you want to do it at home, a 3-bay system, a cubic yard each is really the way to go. A lot of the off-the-shelf systems that you can buy really are just too small. They don't provide for effective composting. So I start off with this here with the soil test, and it's not a compost test, so these ranges are blocked off. While there are certain things you could plant directly into compost, there are you'd be overdoing it in a lot of scenarios, based upon some experiments that I've done, and then just learning more and more about the soil overall, and the interaction it has with different plant life. You can see here, the parts per million for the calcium, is around 12,000. That's 10x the range. So you're not going to want to put something that might be have an issue with excess calcium. If you're trying to grow in here, you might see diminished results. So that would be an amendment. So if you were to mix, if you were to mix this, 1 to 10 with like a soil you were blending together or into your garden into the top, 1 inch into 10 inches, then you could divide those numbers for what you're adding. And then so here's a comparison of 3 different composts. So not all composts are the same. You can see, and I guess a key one here again to speak to would be calcium, just because of the stark difference across the different composts. So one of the composts was made from some of the stuff that we pick up with our home services. Another compost was from the backyard of one of our customers who ended up switching over. We did a compost test for her because she wanted to know kind of what her soil was looking like. I know she would put like a lot of the breakfast stuff in there. She mentioned how she put a ton of eggs all the time. I would attribute the high level of calcium to that. And this third column is a yard material compost that was next to somebody's kind of garden in the back. And so, if you're composting at home, and you're looking to try to find out what you're adding into your soil, if you're going to do a soil test and you're looking to do, some amendments, if you figure out what your compost has for, different nutrient profile, then you might be able to reduce your cost of other amendments if you're trying to add like a certain trace mineral, or if you're trying to determine what sort of like macronutrients you're missing as well, you're looking to add. You can find your nitrogen, in compost as well. This is a UMass test. It's really affordable, in the greater scheme of things, in terms of what you can produce with your soil if it's really vibrant and healthy and balanced right. It's $15 directly at UMass, and then these over here, these 3 are another 6 each. I would say that, soluble salt is really important. I'm going to touch on that, with your salinity. If you're trying to grow crops and they're, very salt intolerant, then you're going to have yield issues. And so knowing that you have, relatively high salts in your compost or in your soil overall can be good to know, to either avoid using that if you're trying to grow something that's extremely sensitive, or find a way to use that, plant something that is more tolerant to that particular environment. Testing limitations as well. This is a bit verbose, but just to so when soil is tested, they're only able to access a limited profile of what is actually in the soil. And so maybe that should be stated before here, but there's a lot more in the soil than what you realize. And what happens is when you have like a soil that's alive, when you have a decent organic matter content, just a few percent, is really a great start. Then those microbes in that fungal network will access other material that's deeper in the soil, and so you can kind of tap into the reserves that are present in the soil itself. Where if you do, and I guess just to exit out of here real quick, I'm going to pull up something to kind of show you what I mean. And let's see. So this is a soil test that I did on, again, this is actually the same compost test results right here. And I also did, so I want to look at lead here. So you can see the soil test had, 0.2 parts per million lead and 15 parts per million aluminum. And if I go down to, let me pull, and so you see here, the parts per million lead is now 10.3. parts per million, because this second test is a fully exhaustive test, and they're able to determine the total amount of lead that's in the soil compared to just the amount that is bioavailable. Let's see what else we have. So copper, just to pull another example, 0.2. And I believe copper is in this test as well. Yeah, so 0.2, 23 parts per million. So some labs will use stronger acids to do the testing for like your trace minerals, for your other items like calcium that aren't going to be in a metal test. These metals are metals that were tested for because they're EPA 503 metals, and they have to do with quality when it comes to biosolids. And I was doing a comparison of our compost versus a biosolid compost, so I wanted to test for all those parameters. The results were kind of nice. So you can see here, this was actually the comparison between the biosolids and the compost. So back into here. I think if I start, it's going to kick me in the beginning, but that's okay. So trace minerals. So a lot of times people, when they think of gardening and growing food, they're really focused on, phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen. And a lot of these other ones are often ignored. If you're getting like people will buy like a 10-10-10 fertilizer, but calcium is important, magnesium is important, sulfur is important, as are all of these. And so when you look at your full soil profile, you can see what might be in excess or what might not, or might be deficient. And plants only exhibit, there's like half a dozen common symptoms that can be attributed to several different, elements. And being able to identify that from a scientific perspective, rather than trying to guess and amend, will allow for you to maybe correct your soil a lot faster, or plant something that can handle those conditions. It's not always a matter of putting more stuff into the soil, but planting, what is appropriate for the soil you're working with. Overall, depending on the school of thought, there's anywhere between 12, 16 essential elements for plant growth, across all plants. And then some are not essential for all, but are essential for others, like selenium, palladium. And they can't really be replaced by others, so that you need all of them in your system in order for plants to grow.
Adam, can we take a couple questions at this point?
Yeah, I didn't see any come up, but I'm definitely happy to. Yeah.
Sure.
Does anybody have any questions on anything?
Yeah. Well, we had one question that came through, actually a couple.
Okay.
There was a request for you to explain a little bit more about why the two soil tests came back with two different values for lead. And I think that's referring to those past soil tests.
Yes. It is odd. I don't see them in my part of the chat, but maybe they were just sent to you directly.
Mm-hmm.
So yes. So the reason why it's different is because one of the soil tests, what they do is they dissolve, and I need to read up on the methodology of doing the test itself to really understand the full procedures. But they use acids that will dissolve, particles in the soil, and then they're able to use, I believe it's spectrometry, to analyze the content of how much is in each soil in terms of your different, parts per million. But the acid that they use is a relatively weak acid, and it only dissolves so much of like your organic material and doesn't make everything accessible. So like if you were to add up, like if you looked at, this soil test here, if if you were to add up all of these numbers, in this column here, and then, yeah, for, your elements, it's parts per million, but you'd only probably get like 30,000 because there's so much else in the soil. I mean, there's a lot of silica when you have your sand. That's not something that's captured here. You could test for that. You could test for a lot of things. You could test for everything. It's just a matter of cost. And but when you have an exhaustive test, like the one I had pulled up earlier, they're able to use really, really strong extraction methods. And I want to say it's just really, really strong acid, but I'm not sure that that's the case. I will learn more about that to be able to answer that question better of what they actually do. But they're looking at the full picture. So they're doing tests that would ultimately find out, the millions of the parts per million, not just 30,000 of the parts per million. And if part of your concern is, I had my soil tested and the lead was, 15 parts per million, but if I had done this full exhaustive test, it would have been 150 parts per million because, this was about 10x. Don't worry about it like that because a lot of that lead it's in forms that aren't bioavailable to the plants. So it's not like that it's sitting in this pool that's really accessible and, that you're only getting a snapshot of the picture. It's kind of bound up and locked into the soil structure overall.
Okay. And then we have another question. How can we determine if soils or compost are clean enough for growing vegetables in the greenhouse? And that's from Rich Longland.
Clean in terms of like the worrying about bringing in like weed seeds, or Rich, could you elaborate on that?
I'm assuming weed seeds or pollutants and so forth.
So if you're purchasing compost, whether it be bagged or by the yard, you should be able to, like most composters are testing their stuff when it comes to, your nutrient profile like we have here. A lot of them will also test for like fungal and bacterial properties because of, some of the initiatives around, the importance of that. But any compost that was like actually composted is going to be alive. And weed seeds, I mean, if they're doing it in an industrial scale, their piles should be getting hot. And that material should be free of weeds. And in terms of the heavy metals, like that other chart I had up there before, that's specifically biosolids compost. So it comes from municipal wastewater treatment. So if like that is sold as an agricultural product, but you would be aware that that's where it's coming from. They'll mark it as like EPA Class A biosolids. So they've tested for those metals. They would have results available to you. They tend to be higher in concentration. It's not allowed for use in organic agriculture, and it also does tend to have higher levels of, or it does tend to have test positive pretty much across the board when they test for pharmaceuticals and different like flame retardants and things like that. So, but if you're making compost, on your own, or you're buying it, you could get a soil test like this. If you're buying it, they should have those results for you in some form or another. It'll be a different table probably depending on where they test it.
Mm-hmm. And then our final question for this segment: are you utilizing the NOP standard for compost? Are you composting with manure?
So everything. So we have a few different places that our stuff is brought to, and based upon our inputs and the processing technology that's implemented, I did design it to meet the requirements for organic agriculture. So that means we don't like we don't bulk with cardboard because cardboard's not allowed in NLP. We pull out like the bioplastics. So if it says compostable, we accept it across the board just to make it simple for people. But the bioplastics really don't break down that well. So we do remove them. And that was also done with consideration for producing a really quality soil. And when I say so, we've approached it but it's not approved yet. And I'll go into what I mean by approved and what the process is for that when I get to the section for organic. But it was designed with that in mind. And so to kind of step back, were there any other questions, or was that you said that was the last one, Anna?
For this segment, there are some follow-up questions, but they might be good for the end. Just some follow-up questions. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so this is, from a study that I found. I really like coming across like different scholarly papers on agriculture and growing, and a few of these next pieces are going to be pulled from some of those. And so this is the sufficiency range for different elements for corn, soy, and what they categorized as small grains, though they could vary. It's kind of a large bucket. And you'll see, so if you had, certain soil conditions, you'd recognize that you might have enough for, growing one crop, but you might not have enough for another. Just looking at, potassium, for instance, you can see, 1.7 to 2.5 for soy, but for corn, the range is up to 5. For, smaller grains, that's 1.25 is the lower end of the spectrum. And so even when you're looking at your soil test results, I would really take them from like a grain of salt, because this range right here is kind of just like a bucket range for like vegetable growing. But vegetables is such a broad category. I mean, much more than even small grains. And so if you want to try to grow something and like you really want to try to grow it well, then you can find information out there that will tell you, what like your ideal levels of different things are. If you can find out like a lot of agricultural colleges will have studies for certain crops that are produced at the grocery store scale. For unique heirloom stuff, it might be tough. Trying to find someone who's been growing that in the past and learn what they've done would be what I would recommend for that sort of thing that might not have as much resources out there. And one thing that I want to do too is when I encourage people to get their soil tested, it's like, hey, measure what you grew, like keep track of that sort of thing, and then that way we can create information that can be shared with everybody on if your soil has this profile, well, that's very similar to this person's soil, and you could grow this very well. I'm not aware of any tool out there that exists that I've come across that says, okay, this is your soil profile, try growing these. What I have come across more of is like, I'm trying to grow this. These are the studies that have been done to show, how well your crop would grow given the conditions that are present. So kind of on the other end of the spectrum, you have your sufficiency, but you also have your phytotoxicity. And so many minerals that are required for your plant to grow are also phytotoxic in larger quantities. So you need to be careful because you could have too much of certain things as well, and then your plant's going to show different issues that even be attributed to deficiency of something else because it inhibits the uptake of that. You can see like manganese is an example here, that's going to compete with iron and magnesium, for binding to help with enzymes, and then also inhibits the calcium, movement within the plant. Boron, I like to talk about this because there was a one presentation I went to recently that spoke of like a 2 to 6 parts per million, and being a trace mineral. It's not something that many people would necessarily think of, from like a small scale grower perspective. And I know that most of what I speak of too tends to be geared towards someone who might not be, growing, from an agricultural perspective with years of experience. So, this is, a common problem with like lack of boron is called hollow heart. And that's when you'll have like holes, like in your potatoes. or your broccoli. Um, and one great source of boron is borax. You can sprinkle that on to your soil. 2 to 6 parts per million is based upon, I believe it's Albright, school of thought when it comes to like how much you need in your soil. And that is more than what UMass typically puts in their recommended range. Another thing with UMass's tests is they always mention like adding lime for like adjusting the pH to sweeten the soil. But there's a lot of other things that will sweeten your soil as well. Anything with calcium in it. So you can do like, bone meal or potash is going to bring your pH up also. So, and depending upon what you're trying to do, you might want to be able to utilize the minerals that are in those, other amendments to adjust your soil overall. Zinc. So, mentioning some of the studies that have been done before, let's go ahead of myself too much. So zinc is, again, all of these elements are vital. I'm not going to dive deeply into each one of them. But zinc with activation of more than 80 different enzymes. Some of the issues with zinc, if you don't have enough, is reduced height, brown spots in the upper leaves, distorted leaves, chlorosis as well. And speaking about the issues with deficiency and then phytotoxicity, this curve right here that you see, kind of at the beginning of the chart, is your dry matter yield per pot, and across the x-axis you have your parts per million of zinc. And so one of the things that I found most interesting with this was that of course no zinc being being a nutrient that's required, you see the yield was significantly less than just 3 parts per million, 7 parts per million, 11 parts per million. Pardon, that's not 7, but I think it's like 1.733 and then 11. And you get that kind of plateau there of your optimum yield. But you see as zinc levels increase, so when you're right here, your yield is dropping off. But one of the things that was really interesting about this is issues with phytotoxicity. So like the plant actually showing symptoms were not visible until it was 97 and 109 parts per million. And so one thing that your soil, tests can reveal is if you have too much of something, but your plant's not even telling you have too much of it, you still could have significant yield loss compared to, a lower concentration of that. And that might allow for you to figure out, kind of what's happening with your soil before your plants tell you. Because they might not be able to, if it's not like too poisonous, if you will. It's like being, being like malnourished versus like exhibiting like a disease due to malnutrition. Another one to kind of dive into a little bit is aluminum. So here we have, it's also something that tends to be phytotoxic for a lot of plants. You can see here 2 different plants where the tolerance of the plant, they just call it a tolerant plant, a sensitive plant. But you can see here how the pH, as that increases, even the plant that is sensitive to aluminum, does grow fine for like its root structure and establish as well. And what that is attributed to is, so at different pHs, your aluminum is going to be in different ionic forms. And so, at your 4.4 pH, right around here, most of your aluminum is in a form of, Al3. And so that's 3, aluminum molecules, or rather that would just be 1 aluminum molecule, rather, in isolation in your soil system, because it's a solution, there's water, so that stuff is going to be dissolved and everything. And then as your pH increases, your aluminum is going to tend to bind to your hydroxide group. So, you can see as the pH, so when you get to your pH, I think it was 5.7, 5.5, I was going to say. So when you're at 5.7, most of your aluminum is in a form, now it's bound to two hydroxides. And so the charge is different, and then the uptake, of that molecule is inhibited because the pH is higher. And that's true for a lot of potential phytotoxic elements. Same thing happens with lead. I don't have a chart right now for the forms of lead, but that would be something to attribute to why lead is, more accessible and bioavailable at a lower pH, just as aluminum is, rather than a higher pH, because the molecule itself is then in different forms. I'm going to skip over these last few. If you guys want the slides, let me know. There's just a few points on why they're important. Copper with flavor and color, if you're trying to make something that's more marketable. This is something, so, we talked about the salinity in your soil. So something that's very salt tolerant versus not. This is celery. And so I'm going to skip back up real quick just so we can look at that soil test. And you'll see here, this was an optional test. This particular sample, the person didn't want to do this one. If I was going to go back and do the test again, knowing what I know now, I would have done them all just to have that data to compare. You can see here, this compost is really, really low in salt, which I'm happy about because that's the stuff that we're working to make more of. And this one here happened to be relatively high in salts. I'm not sure what was in it to cause it, to occur like that. Certain salts too, you can rinse the soil out and you can water things through. Other things are going to stick to your soil, depending on what the properties are from clay perspective and organic matter perspective. And so this here is celery. So you can see here, 0 in terms of DS per M. So that's the measurement of the salts in the soil. To 4 to 8 to 12, and you can really see how the growth of that celery just falls off. And this here is another table where you can look at all different crops. Let's see where. Usually, I'm really good at keeping the sources of things. But you can see here, this information is available for across all crops you're trying to grow. You can see the yield loss at different levels of salinity, where your yield loss is 0. Yield loss is 10%, 25%, 50%. As that salinity goes up, the crop and at what level of salinity you're going to have yield loss occurring. So if you have really salty soil, you might want to try to plant something that is extremely tolerant for the conditions that you have. Here's how a categorization of this, and I could get into all sorts of stuff really, really deeply. So, here, this is actually the file originally that came from. So, there's a lot of university resources out there when it comes to diving deep into any particular topic. So I try to extract the good information I can find to put stuff like this together. So organic. So first we'll talk about organic when it comes to the requirements for the organic program, and then we'll talk about organic matter a little bit as well. And so with compost, it's sort of tricky. It's not like with food. So the word compost can be used with any compost because it has carbon in it. It has organic matter in it. And so it's not regulated the same. If you're trying to grow organic, and that doesn't always necessarily mean that the compost is bad if it doesn't meet requirements for organic or isn't labeled for such, because it can be an expensive program to participate in, depending upon if you're doing a third party, or if you can find a farmer that wants to work with you from compost perspective, then the process is a bit more straightforward. Compost itself, though, is never certified. It's suitable for use in organic agriculture or to meet requirements for organic gardening, something along those lines for a language perspective. is what it matters when it comes to trying to find compost that you can use for organic growing. If you can't be certain that it is, then it needs to be treated like manure when it comes to like being used on a farm. So there's that time you have to wait before you can plant in it to meet your organic regs. In Massachusetts, Bay State Organics can certify compost for, or can approve rather, compost for use in organic agriculture. Because again, compost is not certified. The ingredients, so you can't include, you can use non-synthetic substances, not prohibited, and synthetic substances approved for plant and soil amendments. Those are allowed, and the temperature needs to be 131 degrees. The time for that depends if it's a windrow, it's 15 days and turned 3 times. If it's a static pile or an aerated pile, it's 3 days. And then the turning frequency depends is with the windrows. So different types of compost with the ingredients. So the Class A that I mentioned before, that's your biosolids. Free compost, it's kind of an unknown. Municipal compost, sometimes there's biosolids in municipal compost. They'll mix in their wastewater treatment stuff into their yard material to just kind of find a way to get rid of it. Manure-based compost, sometimes there's stuff mixed in here too. That's important to be aware of. I know of one farmer who mixes in ash and then paper pulp into his manure in order to balance it and then to provide a darker color. It doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong with it. It does have a higher pH because of the ash, so I think it ends up being like a 7.6 or a 7.8. And when he does a blend with 50% loam, it ends up bringing it back down because he mixes in he'll mix in like peat moss as well. And the peat moss, I think pH is like a 4.4. Your yard material, compost as well, and then your food scraps compost. So if you know what your source is, you can kind of get an idea of what's going to be included in there. Bulking and balancing. So, for organics, leaves, wood chips, okay. Paper with recycled content. Cardboard is not allowed for organic compost. And another item too is, so the compost can't be like treated with anything. I believe I touch upon that actually, so I'll mention it if I need to at the end. Mentioned, this already, most of these items. So, organic and, Bay State Omri is a third-party organization that you can pay and they'll come and they'll approve it. So, let's see, touch a bit upon, soil testing, the importance of that. So here's a bioassay. So, just a little bit of the wrong herbicide can really be detrimental to your garden. You can see here, your control is 0 parts per billion. We're looking at soil at parts per million. When you're looking at herbicides, just parts per billion can really impact things. Stepping up to, you can start to see even I would say at 0.97, just the leaves are a lot. They don't have that same vibrancy, lack of vibrancy rather, that dark rich color to them. So it's get lighter and paler, and then you're starting to see the plant shrivel. Even at 7-8 parts per billion. So you can do like your own bioassays. There are labs that will do them for you. I found that they're really expensive, but you can use like cucumber seeds are often recommended because they have a really, really high germination rate. So you're able to check if you have an unknown source. If you're trying to see if it might be contaminated for some reason, then you could do a bioassay with some cucumber seeds, or clover is another seed that will often be used for bioassays to kind of get a look at, to make sure it's something you want to mix into your garden, your land, your garden. Lead. So most of the sources for lead, we talked a little bit about that earlier, but and again, it was a question, so we'll touch on it deeper. Paint and then auto emissions is another big one. A lot of people don't think of that, but back when gasoline was leaded, that exhaust was being sprayed onto the roadways, if you will. So when you get closer to the road, if you get compost that's made with like street sweepings, like mixed in with yard material. So in urban environments, you tend to have higher concentrations of lead in municipal compost because they're doing a lot of the street sweepings. Depending on the organization, there's different levels that are deemed safe rather. 300 parts per million for the EPA is what's deemed safe to grow in. What's deemed recommended is 200 parts per million or lower. Cornell, is 150. Minnesota says 100. Less is always better. Our average soils have 7 to 20 parts per million in the U.S. And the exposure to it's more really when you're working with the soil than what's being taken up by the plants. I've seen the study and it was like carrots with lead, and they intentionally planted some carrots into an area that had it was like over 200 parts per million. I want to say, but the amount of lead that was in the carrot itself wasn't that much. And you would think carrots being directly in the soil that it would be a lot more. They tend to be higher concentrations in leafier vegetables as well. And then again mentioning your pH, that impacts the lead uptake. Higher phosphorus and higher organic matter too will also inhibit the uptake because it will bind to the organic matter. Looking up more info on your most of your bagged stuff. I mean, these guys are pretty popular. You'll see it is approved for use in organic, but you're missing like a lot of your testing results, so you can't really see what else is in it. And you can if you reach out to anyone who's making soil or worm casting, they should have that information. Going back to organics a little bit. This is what you'd be looking for something that's approved for use in growing organic food, and this doesn't really mean anything. It just means it's organic from a material perspective. Going back to ingredients, and I recognize now that a couple of those slides were definitely not in the order they should have been. All food scraps can be included in organic compost, or compost for use in organic agriculture, rather. Even non-organic. Untreated yard material can be included as well, as can treated. What I recently learned, you wouldn't treat the compost as it's being processed, but it's understood that there's going to be a residual amount of stuff across the board. Animal manure is fine, of course, and spent mushrooms, growing media. Wax cardboard is not allowed. Not recycled content paper. I'm surprised at that one actually, just because of its raw paper, virgin paper, if you will, or versus recycled content. There really shouldn't be much of a difference in terms of what is actually in it. I think that's probably just an incentive to promote recycling and to support that the industry and the reuse. Bioplastics are not allowed. Speaking with some of the bioplastic companies that make compostable wares, they share that they're trying to get it approved. Part of the challenge is, and then the list of stuff that's allowed for use in organic growing is relatively large. That is synthetic, and so bioplastics, I guess it's like a 4-year board, or it's like maybe it might be even 2 years, where like there's like turnover and then they have to start again, like every time they were saying. But right now we pull it doesn't break down that well anyway, and you end up with like chips and shredded plastic, or not real plastic, but it looks like it. So. Compost starters are excluded, biosolids specifically excluded, urea as well. And then synthetic substances, that's where I knew I had it firm somewhere else. Synthetic substances allowed for use in organic growing are disallowed as raw ingredients for compost as well, for compost that meets requirements for organic growing. The process that needs to start between the carbon and nitrogen ratio 25 to 40 to 1. In vessel, for 3 days, winter out for 15 days, pile turn 5 times. Pardon, I said 3 earlier. Here's talking about residues for pesticides. So it is understood that there's going to be certain levels of residual pesticides in the background noise, if you will, of our environment. But the compost is still allowed for use. Some composts have been pulled, because of levels though. And so sometimes, it's just too much and it's deemed no longer suitable for that type of growing application. And so the other kind of page of organic, if you will, is the actual organic matter. Organic matter is something that it's really important when it comes to your soil. If you've been treating your soil with just like your chemical fertilizers, you haven't you've never done like cover crops before, I would highly encourage cover crops. It's something that's going to protect your soil during the winter months. It's going to add organic matter into your soil as well. And cover crops are going to reduce erosion too. I spoke with a farmer at a recent conference. He was a drought a few years ago, and he had shared he was at another conference actually. Someone had posed the question of who had good yield, and he was one of the few to raise his hand. He attributed it to his organic matter being up at around 6%. He's just able to hold on to a lot more water. It's able to support the plants. It hold on to your anions in your soil as well, and I'll touch on that in a second. And compost itself is very, very high in organic matter, because it's essentially that's what the entire all that's being put into there is organic matter to begin with, for that process. And it is so the different types of.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes.
I had a question that came up. It was actually kind of a series of questions, and I know you're starting to wrap up. But Lori had a question about what's the best test to show both the available and biologically bound nutrient content levels of compost. And are you familiar with the Haney soil test? And if you are familiar, can this be used for compost as well?
So what's the term again? What type of soil test?
Haney soil test, Haney.
Haney. Okay. I've heard of it. From my understanding, it's kind of a newer type of soil test. Is that correct, Anna? Are you familiar with that test?
I am not. This is the first time I've heard about it. So
okay, I'm pretty sure it's a new method of testing soil that recently has come out, and from my understanding, it is relatively pricey. I don't know how they go about testing. From my understanding, it is supposed to be a little bit more accurate. There are a lot of other types of tests that you can do as well. There's a test that does like soil respiration, so it'll actually measure like the CO2 that's coming off of your soil, and that's a measurement of the biological activity within it. I do not know any. So the thing is, it's kind of tough. You would have to take the same sample and test it in kind of an exhaustive method and a non-exhaustive method to see what the differences are, because as soon as you put that sample into something that's going to kind of like fully extract everything, it's a destructive process. And so, I don't know like what particular tests are out there that would encompass broad ranges of things like the soil, like a standard soil test would. You can put compost through any types of tests, and you can learn different things about it. The information would be interpreted differently than a standard soil test. UMass Amherst used to do compost testing, where they were looking at things like your carbon to nitrogen ratio, because a finished compost used to have, or will have, like around like a 10 to 12 to 1 final carbon to nitrogen ratio. So that was a way to test your maturity of your compost. There was like one other one too, that another result or test that was incorporated in there that you can do like total carbon, you can do total nitrogen. But I found that just going with a standard soil test was a great way to get a lot of the other information that was in there at a much more affordable price. Like doing a compost test when it does your final C to N and your total carbon. Those were around like 85. I think it's the cheapest one I found a couple years ago, where a standard soil test is 15. So that's why I elected to go that way. Were there other? So in terms of like the quick answer with the testings is I don't have enough information to be able to provide guidance there, I suppose.
And the last question I have is concerning cardboard. You had mentioned not using cardboard for organic composting. Is there at any time that you could ever use cardboard?
So I mean, I would use it for like if I were to have an area of like a yard that I wanted to grow within, but I didn't want to necessarily till. You could like lay down a bunch of cardboard and kind of kill off all the grass. That would be a good way. Um, a lot of it too is like it's in mass. Like if you have a bunch of something, you can get you start to build up the potential toxins associated with it. Some cardboard is clean, but I've recently learned about like food wares and like food grade paper products that have like polyfluorinated chemicals in them, and that's something that's a known carcinogen. It sticks to us, it sticks to organic matter in the soil, um, and just a matter of, I mean, if we're able to avoid, and it's stuff like that. It's really challenging for me because we did an event and they wanted to use compostable wares. They didn't want to use plastic wares, and they were like, oh, I always encourage people to just bring their own dishes and reuse, but they said they couldn't have people bring their dishes in because it wouldn't meet their their kosher requirements. Dishes were brought from outside, and so they went with the compostable. And I know that the compostable wares sometimes have the polyfluorinated chemicals in the paper pulp because of like the manufacturing process, and it does build up a little bit. But it's like, and it's better than plastic, I feel. And so it's just tough. Certain things that there's always trade offs within the system. Um, if you pull like, and then with the soil too, if you add one thing, you're adding other things. You're never usually adding 100% of that one element. So everything's kind of an intertwined system where you pull one and everything else moves a little bit with it. So were there other questions to touch upon before I continue? And I'll move quickly through these
Oh, no,
aspects.
that was it for that segment. Thank you.
Right. And so types of organic matter. So you have your like dead tissues. You have bits of leaves. You have dead tissues from plants. You have your living organisms, so your biomass. So that's your bacteria network, and you also have your non-living tissue. That's your acids, your humic acids, your fumic acids, anything that's carbon based that's in the soil. The reason why organic matter is important, and I include clay in this as well because they're reciprocals of one another in a way, where your organic matter is going to hold on to your anions. So your negatively charged particles are going to bind to your organic matter because your organic matter, typically constitutes positively charged particles. And then your clay is going to hold on to your positively charged particles. So what happens is if you have like a really, really sandy soil, with no, let's call it no clay, if you will, and you apply magnesium or potassium, or yeah, then that can run off, with rain because you don't have the ions there, don't have the surface to kind of cling on to until the plants are then pulling them into their system. So then that's the importance of each of those are significant in the soil. So your organic matter helps hold on to your negatively charged ion in addition to the water retention that was mentioned earlier. Another really, really large benefit. And it's also the home for your biology of your soil. I'm just going to skip over that. And so over time, the organic matter in your soil would degrade. Um, it's going to vary upon local conditions. I wouldn't necessarily, say after year one, a third of it's going to live, or a third of it's going to remain, or a fifth of it. It does vary based upon local conditions. But with cover crops, you can definitely bring more into it. I mean, your plants are secreting sugars into the soil. About 30%, from what I understand, of the carbon that's brought into a plant system through its respiration does not go into the cellular structure, but actually goes into the soil to feed the microbes that symbiotically live with the plants to increase the range of the plant roots, if you will. And then with your microbiology. So this is kind of a close-up look at kind of your microaggregates, if you will. So your clay, your humus rather. All those little clumps in your soil. If you pull your plant out and the roots are bare, that's an issue. You want your roots to have these clumps of soil kind of connected to it, and you're going to have a bit of everything in there. So you can see here, here's kind of a comparison of soil this was actually an awesome example of cover crops. This was from a presentation that I had watched from a woman who was speaking about some farms in Australia. And there's one farm that does cover crops. They allow for this native grass to grow during their warm season, because their cold season is actually when it's more appropriate for their crops to grow. And then the grass naturally dies off because it can't take the colder temperatures. And then that's when they plant the wheat again. But every other farm in that entire community does not use cover crops, and they get kind of treated like outcasts in a way from their community. And when it first got started, people were thinking that it wasn't going to be successful. They didn't know what they were doing. They thought it would ruin the field and all of this stuff, but they have better yield and less inputs because of just solely because they're using cover crops. The bacteria, it's going to have, like I mentioned before, the soil web of life interacts symbiotically with the plant. The bacteria is going to unlock minerals that's going to be contained within the organic matter as it continues to eat that and free up those minerals. And then the plant, as I mentioned, secrete sugar into the soil to promote bacteria growth and to allow for them to kind of work and harmony with one another. Another big thing with soil bacteria is there's a whole class of bacteria that will fix nitrogen. And so if you're looking at, you're worried about your nitrogen in your soil being low, if you look at like your three sisters, if you will, corn, beans, and squash, the beans, are going to promote a certain type of nitrogen, a certain type of bacteria that fixes nitrogen. And so what you see here are these little nodules of those bacteria that are fixing nitrogen into the soil. Our atmosphere is 78% nitrogen, so there's plenty of nitrogen in the air. And if we, plant the right things, we can have the soil build up its own nitrogen supplies rather than looking to treat it chemically. The fungal network, in terms of tilling, so a lot of movement has been going toward like no-till gardening. A lot of that is attributed to the fungal network because the fungal network is their hairs, their fibers, they break apart really easily. And when you till it, it's like taking an earthquake through the entire entire city. And so the no-till approach allows for that to remain intact. What I had done with a community garden recently is I did like a double dig, and I essentially tilled it. But I'm going to leave it like that next year, and I won't. And I've talked with someone that she'll like remineralize the soils like every few years. So that way the fungal network, after the first several months will allow for it to be built back up and remain. And populations of fungi decrease too upon their aerobic creatures, if you will, or living systems. And so they need the oxygen. And so it's good to avoid the soil compaction. A lot of different, bacteria, a lot of different fungi are really beneficial to, certain plants. And then others, it kind of just varies on what you're trying to grow. This here, and then the analogy I make is so like your root is your river, if you will. So this here is your root of a plant. Your fungal network is sort of like your tributaries and your streams. that will feed the plant system of the ocean. So the fungi will, connect with your root system, and they allow it to kind of just reach further into the soil structure. As we kind of transition out, here's a couple of growing experiments I did. This was in a garden. I took just a handful of compost and put it into the romaine on the right versus none on the left, and you can see a significant difference in growth. And this is another growing experiment. I attribute this. One thing that I found most fascinating about this is less compost was more. So a lot of times I'll read articles that'll say use like 4 inches of compost, 6 inches of compost. Sometimes it's from compost makers, and they're just trying to sell a lot of stuff. But the goal of this is that when I put this together was to enable growing up more food. And so trying to find what that maximum amount of compost isn't beneficial. I want to find that optimal amount that will maximize yield, like these green beans here. This photo was tilted. These 3 rows of beans were actually all about the same size. This was 1 inch of compost. This was 2 inches, and this was 3 inches. The experiment was done on the roof from August to October for 2 months. So it wasn't your peak growing season. I pulled it because things were starting to freeze, and I wanted to be able to properly capture the biomass that was grown. But if you had the same amount of compost, even if the yield was the same, if you had 2 inches worth of compost and you had the same green bean size, well, grow twice as much space instead of growing just in one spot with a certain amount, and stretch the resources further. This is a final one I did where I started off. It was about 1/4 of a cup of compost down to no compost, planted right in the root system. What I did here as well is I did some intercropping, so I planted either red onions, green onions, or leeks in between every lettuce plant. Like in between, like every lettuce plant was planted like a little triangle instead of a square as well, if you will, from the grid perspective. So that triangular network plants were able to be planted closer together to still maintain that minimum distance of about 4 inches is what I was going for. So you can get like another row in, essentially, like if I were to extend this out farther in that same space because of how they were planted. And with the intercropping, you can get plants that grow, in that little bit of space that isn't being consumed by like the bushier lettuce. One benefit too with how close this was planted is I didn't have to weed anything because the only things that were growing were things that I wanted to grow because they were planted close together. If you read instructions like a pack of seeds and it says, like plant your plants 6 inches apart in rows 18 inches apart, those 18-inch rows are only 18-inch rows because that's giving you space to move through the garden. And so if you can plant, 3, 4, 5 rows deep at 6 inches, it's just as far as you can reach. And then, reach out and then that's as far as you can reach. Make that the middle of your patch, of your block of plants, if you will, because then you can reach the other half from the other side. And if you plant, if it's 6 inches apart instead of rows of 18 inches apart, that's 3 times as much that you can grow in that same space. So it's a great way to maximize the space that might be available to you. I guess the big takeaway I would say is to get your soil tested. And then I did mention a couple other organizations that I just wanted to plug because I'm liking the work that they're doing. One is the Experimental Farmer Network. They'll do different programs where they'll work with people. They'll get you seeds. People will be leading different projects to increase the range of certain crops. Some stuff that you might not have heard about before. These are really neat. They're like a berry, but they look like potatoes. And they also have like this really large tuber as well. On this project, they're trying to push, this particular butternut variety further into Canada, and create more cold tolerant varieties. But you can see there's a lot of different, projects they have going on to, increase access of, or to increase the range of a lot of crops. And then the other one too, and they're putting together, they're doing more and more experiments. They're looking at like they're doing plant tissue analysis in combination with soil testing. They're limited on the number of people they can work with due to funding, but if people wanted, I think they've kind of maxed out for this season. But they'll look at like parts per million in the soil, and then they're going to expand upon that a lot farther than they've done before. And then they'll look at the parts per million in the plant itself, and they're going to look to make different correlations and really look at like the data behind it from a chemistry perspective. One thing I don't think they're incorporating is I don't know if they're looking much at the biological aspect of things, but this is pretty neat, I thought, and that's our Real Food campaign. That's with the Bionutrient Food Association. If you're familiar with them, you might have seen them before. So, but yeah. So, does anybody have any questions at all about the information that I went over today? I'm happy to stay on for as long as it takes to address any initial questions.
Adam, just had one additional question that came through on biosolids. I think I saw on one of the slides about being careful of certain biosolids. Are there biosolids that are good for compost, not good for compost?
So biosolids is the material that comes out of like a wastewater treatment facility, and so the issue is it's not like the human manure aspect of things, where if it's your own and like you're composting it, that's fine. But we don't take it from people right now. I've actually thought about maybe doing something like that in the future, where we do like really look at like individuals. But the issue with biosolids overall is it's the entire drain network of a city. And so if like a painter washes his brush or somebody dumps Drano down the drain to declog something, all of that is what's getting mixed into the system. And they don't test for a lot of the stuff, and a lot of the stuff doesn't get extracted. So I would say like the best use of a biosolid would be for like sod production or like highway projects. And there are some farmers that will use it for agricultural production, but it's explicitly disallowed for use in organic growing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then lastly, just if anyone wants additional information or to see you in person, are you going to be presenting at any additional events in the region?
Yeah, we're coming up. This particular event's not free, but there's a Farm to Institute conference next week at UMass. And then I also do free gardening classes right now. Right now they're scheduled for once a month on the second Thursday in Gardner. I do a morning session at 10:30 and then an afternoon session or an evening session at 7. I may increase that to twice a month. And then if anyone ever wants to have something closer to them, I'm happy to. I want to be teaching more and, diving into unique topics like, the salinity, for instance, and kind of like, someone has a soil test and they're trying to grow some stuff, figuring that out maybe as in a group setting. But classes in Gardner again, and I do, like, if you subscribe to City Compost, I'm going to look to get the events that we're participating in. And we do talks. A lot of the talks are getting close to wrapped up for the season, because they tend to happen during the winter months for like your conferences, like the Gardeners Gathering through the trustees. That was this past Saturday.
Okay. And then down to our last two, where do you make your compost, and do you own a farm?
So I'm actively looking for space. I don't own any of the land that the compost is being made on at this point in time. I do want to have the space that I acquire, some of that area designated towards growing. I think primarily it's going to be focused on like experimental growing, and then also unique varieties of things. I want to grow some like yellow grove bamboo. I know yellow grove is a variety of bamboo that will grow well around here, and I think it's an awesome material for structural purposes. So I'm interested in kind of seeing, what that can do. And, but yeah, right now, so within the compost, it goes to one of three areas. A space in orange where all of our stuff is processed with just our stuff. So that way I can ensure quality in and quality out. Those that use our services, that's where they're getting their finished compost from. We give free compost back with service based upon what is put in 6 months. And then, this is also not accurate right here, as I just look up and see that the pricing that's old. It's less now. And then other material goes to Hamilton and Needham at this point in time. And so one thing that's unique with City Compost is that everything we pick up, we make sure that goes towards the soil at a minimum. And then my goal is to ultimately have everything that's picked up go towards growing more food as well, rather than just going to a composting place where they might be selling it for like landscape application or like Department of Transportation projects or something like that.
Okay. Well, that was the last of our questions. Adam, it was really a pleasure to have you on our webinar series today. I think questions will still be coming in during the week. If people would like to reach out to you, learn more about your processes or City Compost, they can reach you at adamj@citycompost.com. That's correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. And if you want to sign up for City Compost, you can also go to the website. I believe it's at www.citycompost.com.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, great, great. I'd like to thank everyone who stayed for the entire webinar. This was chock full of wonderful information that is a now benefit. We can use it right now. And if you have any additional questions, you can reach out to me at anna@nofamass.org. We will get a copy of the presentation and send it out to folks. And again, if there are additional questions that we didn't get to tonight, feel free to email me or Adam, and we'll get those answered for you. Next month, we're going to hear from Malika Gelpin and the folks at One Art Community Center in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We'll talk a little bit how they merge art, growing food, feeding people in their One Art Cafe. So look forward to having everyone on that webinar. Tell a friend. And if you have any suggestions or questions, again, you can reach me at anna@nofamass.org or call me at 413-214-1237. And just to remind everyone, you'll see topics like this at the summer conference that's coming up August 10th and 11th at Hampshire College. So please go to our website to get more information and to get registered. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Have a great evening. Speak with you soon.
Thank you again, everyone.